Well, Randy, thanks for being here with the Western Journal. You're actually re-releasing a fantastic book that you wrote. The name of the book is We Hold These Truths. And it's coming out at a perfect time because the 250th anniversary of the country is coming up. But I'd like to know just right off the top, what motivated you to write this book?
I was actually kind of walking on the battlefield at Gettysburg, and the notion came to me. I think I'm supposed to write this book. Like I had a friend. I was working in a congressman's office at the time, volunteering between the end of the campaign and the beginning of potentially the term of the office holder for attorney general, actually. And he said you should write a book about the things you care about, since that's what you really want. And I said maybe I will. And so I was walking in Gettysburg at Little Round Top, actually, and I thought of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and everything they risk. And I thought, I can certainly risk my savings and not having this job right away to kind of knock out this book, based on the knowledge I'd gained at Regent University. And I'd written a paper about the Declaration of Independence, which was more legalese. And I wanted to write like a narrative. And so that's what this was. This is like showing the influence of the Declaration of Independence through our U.S. history, starting, of course, with the Revolution, or even before the Revolution with Patrick Henry and Give Me Liberty, Give Me Death, or Give Me Death, and Stamp Act. So I give a brief history of all that, but Patrick Henry is my opening chapter, and actually the very opening scene in the book is the introduction with the Liberty Bell ringing and the first reading of the Declaration of Independence a few days after it was actually signed there at the Continental Congress. And so I've been there. I've been in that hall. I've thought about everything, and I certainly talked to the park rangers and got stuff for the book from them. And so, yeah, that's how it came to be. But with the 250th anniversary approaching, I thought I really need to revisit this. So the first edition came out in '07, and it did fine. It got endorsed by Wall Builders at that time, which is a good God and Country group, and I've read
Yeah,
some of their
absolutely.
materials. Yeah, some of their materials helped me even in this book, so I give credit to them in the book. But then, and the Library of Congress put it in its general collection. It led to me being hired on a documentary film, which I really enjoyed, called I Want Your Money in 2010, which was in theaters. And so it was the gateway to a lot of different things. And, but with this anniversary coming up and everything that had happened in almost the 20 years since then, I thought it needed an update. And Charlie Kirk was, part of that. I live here in Phoenix, and so I would go to events. I'd interviewed him a couple times over the years for the Western Journal at CPAC, and uh, been to his events here, and did a 2020 interview, which I include a good portion of in the book, about socialism, which is very timely right now. And so I thought I needed to add some Charlie Kirk things and just a lot of stuff like how do we influence culture? Like I have a whole new chapter in it about how do Christians and this belief in the subtitle of the book is Two Beliefs That Change the World, or that's the shortened subtitle anyway. And those two beliefs are a belief in God-given rights and divine providence. And so in the last chapter, well, throughout the book, I'm certainly dealing with those issues and stories about them and how the ideas from the Declaration became our laws. I look at the Revolution, the Civil War, World War II, and then today. And each of those, the first three sections end with justice established. So the Revolution, we got the Constitution. The Civil War, we got the Civil War amendments, freeing the slaves, equal protection under the law, rights to vote. And then World War II, we actually brought those ideas. I say liberty passed on. We actually brought those ideas to
Hmm.
Germany and Japan and saved Europe. The Allies. It was an Allied
Oh,
effort, but we were a big part of that, the main part of the Western drive. And so that's all in the book. Each of the three sections of my book has a cultural leader. So like the Revolution has Thomas Paine. So there's a whole chapter about Thomas
mhm.
Paine. And then there's a whole chapter about Frederick Douglass. And then there's a whole chapter about Frank Capra, who was a director of
Yeah.
many Hollywood movies. And he did a documentary film series during World War II for the Department of War. And
I didn't know
so I
that.
thought, yeah, yeah, it was called Why We Fight. And so I go into detail, of course, that whole chapter is about that sort of stuff. And I thought Charlie Kirk is one of those kind of people. He's a Thomas Paine for our time. Uh, he he was Thomas Paine, although he had later in life, he was like making arguments against whether the Bible was, really the word of God, and it had whatever. But when you read Common Sense and you read the
Mhm.
American Crisis series and stuff, it's all God and country stuff. He's just,
Yeah.
especially Common Sense, he's quoting all portions of the Bible and how we shouldn't have a king, and Gideon and Gideon and Gideon. We didn't have a king with Gideon and Samuel and all this stuff. And it's a
Mm.
lot. It's not just one or two little passages. And I was surprised myself to kind of reread it when I was doing the research for the book. And I thought that's what Charlie Kirk was doing. He was a God and country guy. He was like,
Yeah.
if we lose our faith in God and the Judeo-Christian ethic, we lose our freedom. And that's what Thomas Paine was saying. He's like, hey, our king is in heaven and he doesn't wreak havoc on us like the King of England does. And if we
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
found an if we want to found a new nation, we should base it on the word of God. That's exactly what he says in Common Sense. He uses that exact language. let's
Mm.
let's issue a new charter. This was Common Sense came out like 7 months before the Declaration, 6, 7 months in January of 1776. And
Mm.
so he's like, let's have a charter and let it be built on, founded on the word of God. And that's what the Declaration is. The very first sentence of the Declaration is based on the laws of nature and nature's God. We're going to tell you why we
Yeah.
need to depart from this relationship with England. So yeah, I think Charlie Kirk was definitely a Thomas Paine figure, and just as Thomas Paine raised alarms and made arguments based on scripture and reason, which Charlie did as well. He wasn't just talking about, he was talking policy, separate from Christian values. He was just saying these are good, reasonable policies. So yeah, that's how I see him, a modern day Thomas Paine.
One of your outstanding interviews with him, in one of them, you talked with him about socialism. How do you think socialism has marched on, not just since 2007, but it's marched on since 2016? It has marched on radically since Charlie's assassination, with what we've seen in New York with Mamdani, and now this horrific primary winner named, I think her last name's Chevalier, and
Yeah.
she's openly supporting the destruction, the eradication of the United States. So, what do you think? You interviewed Charlie on this. What do you think
Yeah.
he would have to say about it?
Yeah, and I just wrote an article recently about it again too. I thought after these wins on the Tuesday primary in New York, I thought, my Lord, what he said in 2020 is coming true. Because I asked him at the
It
time,
is.
there was a poll that came out at the time that said 7 in 10 millennials, it was a YouGov poll, would be inclined to vote for a socialist, candidate, and which was surprising at the time. And I'm sure that that's translated now to Gen Z as more they're into the voting age now. But in 2020, the millennials were the 20s and early 30s and whatever. And so yeah, he said that I asked him specifically about AOC, who had won in 2018 in Democrat Socialists. And he said, I've been raising these alarm bells for years that this is going to
Mm.
grow, unless we counter it. And of course, that's what TPUSA has been doing, is trying to educate conservatives. And
Yeah,
Trump's percentage of conservatives went up in 2024. I mean, of young people went up in 2024. So they've
yeah,
had
radically.
success. And Charlie Kirk, I'm sure, was a good part of that. And so yeah, he just said this is going to multiply. You're going to see more members of Congress from this because it's popular. They've been teaching these ideas on the college campuses now for years. And he said people like AOC, he had some little funny quote to the effect of, she's always sure of herself, but hardly never right. Like she has such certainty about what she believes that because she's just been shooting it back and forth at Boston University and other college campuses wherever she's been. But
The
he's like,
deadly
oh, this,
combination of arrogance and ignorance. It's just such a horrible combo, and she has it in spades.
and that's what you see with some of these people who won, Tuesday night. They're just so certain of their ideas
Yeah.
and stick it to the man and all this stuff. But anyone, the Latin American people or anybody who's come out of socialism, the people from Eastern Europe, they're
Yep.
just like, you guys are crazy. This doesn't work. You chase wealth away, and then there's less opportunity for everybody, and the money runs out. As Margaret Thatcher famously said, problem with socialism, you eventually run out of other people's money.
Yeah. Do you think Charlie would be surprised at how fast it has advanced really just since his death? These last couple of elections, do you think he'd be surprised?
Um, no, because in that interview, he said a few times how, he alarming it is, and that this is moving and this will grow and this is going to happen fast. And so, yeah, I think it was Jeffries that was saying today. So we've had a few, and now we're going to have a few more. So he was trying to downplay the fact that he's going to be getting more Democrat socialist members in his caucus, but it's the same. So even if they aren't outward Democrat socialists, that wing of the party is going to drive
Yeah.
the actions that the Democrats
Yeah.
take, because
Already
they'll be
is.
afraid that the same thing that happened to them, like two incumbents got voted out, on Tuesday, Goldman and another person in New York. So that will be the threat to all the members, unless they're in, who knows, a more reddish state, where they have to be a little more centrist. But anybody who's any sort of blue state or anything is going to become a Democratic socialist in effect, I would say, most of them.
Why do you think that Judeo-Christian heritage is vital to maintaining liberty?
Yeah, in the introduction of the book, I start to lay out the argument, and then I use the events in the book to kind of build on it. But it's counterintuitive in a way. You think, oh, if there's no God and there's no rules, then that's more liberty.
Yeah.
But it's actually
Yeah.
the gateway to tyranny. And so, the French Revolution is a good example of that. They jettisoned God, and they were going to go over a 10-day week, and they were doing everything.
Reason would lead us. Would lead
biblical
them
worldview, yeah,
to the guillotine.
And then they were killing people, guillotine. Yeah. And so that's where socialism leads, really, and godlessness, is that there's no accepted rules of right and wrong, that there's no, like in the Nuremberg trials, which I deal with in the book too, Justice Jackson was saying, he talks about the pre-Christian ages is what the German Nazis went back to. The Nationalist Socialists is what Nazi stands for, Nationalist Socialist Workers Party or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And so he was, and Churchill said things like that, and Roosevelt, all of them kept saying, comparing the pre-Christian ages to what they're dealing with now with the barbarism under Hitler and his attacks on, taking over East, all of Europe or much of it. And so Judeo-Christian, like when there are the 10 Commandments, I kind of go into too. The 10 Commandments create corresponding rights. Thou shalt not kill means there's a right to life. Thou shalt not steal. There's a right to property. False witness. There's a right not to be falsely accused of a crime, which happens so often in these totalitarian governments. Like, what was it? Stalin's buddy said, "Find me the man, and I'll show you the crime." Something.
Yeah, Beria. Yeah, that's exactly what he said. Show me the man, I'll show you the crime.
And we were getting that really in the last administration. They were going after people, Trump, of course, but even his supporters. They were going. You could see the beginnings of how this all works under Democrat socialism. Really, is that you outlaw the other view is how it goes, because there's no God, there's no right and wrong. It's just whatever those in power deem best. And so, like John Kennedy said, for America, we believe the rights of the man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. And to put a little Kennedy in there, and so, but that's a powerful statement, because that socialism is the exact opposite. The rights of man come from the generosity of the state, whoever's in charge, and not the hand of God. And Trump's been really good on this issue. He's made that point over and over again, that we believe our rights come from God, not government, because that sets limits on government, which means more liberty. So that's the very nub of the issue. You want limits on government, and you want accepted, universally accepted or mostly accepted, if you can't get everybody on board, but standards of right and wrong that apply to the individual and apply to the government.
All of a sudden, the country doesn't agree anymore that Christianity is the way. And then it looks to me like everything begins flying apart when we don't have that unified culture anymore.
No, yeah, I think my book title, We Hold These Truths, part of it is to say we need unity. We've got to believe that these certain things are true, that there is a God who's created divine laws that that if we enact laws that contravene that, then it's going to hurt society and it's going to create disunion. And and we have to believe that God still, he's just, and that he governs over the affairs of this world. And of course, we have free will too, but our mission is to accomplish God's will on earth. And God never forced anybody, like people say, oh, that's church and state. God never forces. And Madison and Jefferson were so strong on this in Virginia with religious liberty. The Bible doesn't force anybody to believe it. Jesus never forced anybody to believe him. And so certainly his followers shouldn't be forcing anybody to believe Jesus is this. But universal laws are true regardless of what, if governments pass laws that contravene the laws of nature, they're not true. They hurt human personality, and they hurt society, and create distrust. They put, I don't know, that anything becomes reasonable. I mean,
it does seem like God, almost reached down from heaven and manually shifted things around in favor of the U.S. One of the neat instances you talk about is the Battle of Long Island back during the War for Independence. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's ironic that it should be Long Island too, since New York is where all this craziness is happening.
Yeah.
But yeah, no,
Long Island's still trying to hold on to the Republicans.
Yeah, they're more conservative over there.
Yeah.
But the battle does end up ultimately in Manhattan, but in the Revolutionary War as well. But so yeah, the general, just for the general thrust of things, like the war started in Boston, Massachusetts, and then Washington and the troops there were able to kick the British out, and that's in the book. But it's but so the British then hit in New York City, which was the commercial hub of the colonies, the most prosperous port. And Washington foresaw this. Once they left Boston, he knew they'd be back, and they came back with 30,000 troops and a lot of ships. So they're like, we are going to put this thing down. This is over. And because Washington had, a few thousand men. And so he stationed half of them on Long Island and then half in Manhattan to just kind of see where the British were going to go. And their ships showed up in the harbor. And so eventually he saw that it was going to be Long Island. And then they made defenses there, but then he realized what they were really going to do is encircle him. They were going to come up the East River with ships, and they were going to trap over half of his army. And that was, the jig was probably pretty well going to be up.
Catastrophic. Yeah.
And so he made plans to evacuate over to Manhattan over the East River. But what they needed was divine help to do it, because the British had their ships and And so this fog moved in. A peculiar fog is what some firsthand accounts said. And it just kind of hung in there. And it was like not foggy where they needed it to not be foggy, but foggy, where it was. And also some heavy rain fell, which kind of prevented the British from sound. They decided to delay their attack. And so they delayed it a day. And then Washington came up with this plan to move the troops over to Manhattan to reunite his army. And but they needed help. So fortunately, some troops from Massachusetts had just shown up like the month before, who were very good at working boats and things like that. And ferrying people across bodies of water. And so they were the ones in charge of all this. And so they started moving the troops, but then as daylight came, there were still a significant number on the Long Island side. And so it was potentially going to be a slaughter, and or at least all of them getting captured, and if they didn't get killed. So, but then this fog rolled in, and so they moved the rest of the people across the water, and then Washington was in the last boat, and they pushed off and into the foggy river. And then soon thereafter, the fog lifted, and the British went in to find just kind of smoldering campfires and nobody there. And so it's one of the things there's accounts about it in multiple books, but I read some of the firsthand documents and compilations of those firsthand accounts. And so it was just, they attributed it to Providence at the time.
You talk about the prayer card that General Patton had printed and distributed to his men. General Patton, not the most evangelical Christian conservative officer we've ever had, but he prints up this prayer card and distributes it. and God is in the midst of all of this. Share a little bit about all of that.
Well, yeah, I love Patton. I went to West Point, and so there's a statue of him there, and he's of course a legend there. But and I loved him even from the movie growing up and everything, the Patton movie, and
George C. Scott,
yeah, Oscar winner, all that good stuff. So it's just inspiring.
Seven Oscars. I looked it up.
So he in the movie they portray this, but they put a little Hollywood in there, but and they don't mention the prayer cards, but so Patton helped break they broke out of Normandy, and Patton was one of the big forces. They'd been kind of trapped there for a few months after D-Day, and the terrain was tough. And so Patton led the breakout, and they charged across Europe. But then the weather turned, and it started just raining a lot, and there weren't as paved roads so much back then, or certainly not as many.
Yeah.
And it was just a lot of mud, and so they couldn't really go forward with their mechanized vehicles, and that's the way wars were fought at that point. And it also kept their air cover down quite a bit because it was just low hanging clouds, and so all the Allied advantages were getting knocked out. It's almost seems spiritual, like the devil himself was moving it, the prince of the power of the air.
Yeah.
And
trying to exterminate the Jewish people. I mean, that sounds exactly right to me.
So Patton, towards the end of November, early December of 44. So D-Day had happened in June of 44. He called his chaplain up on the phone. They were at headquarters. He's like, "Do you have a weather prayer? I need a weather prayer." and so Patton was like Episcopalian, and he believed in God, but he believed in reincarnation. He believed in
like a touch of Native American Indian in there too. I need a weather prayer.
Yeah. So anyway, the chaplain obliged. She was a Catholic priest, and so he said, "I don't have one, but I'll certainly draft one for you." And so so he typed it up on a 3x5 card and delivered it. He hand delivered it then to Patton, and he's like, here's the weather card. And I put a Christmas greeting to the troops on the backside. And he's like, "Yeah, this is good." And they didn't know what he wanted to do with it, but he said, "Okay, I want you to print 250,000 prayer cards and distribute it to all the troops in his Third Army." So there were a few million Allied soldiers on the Western side, but Patton had 250,000 of them, and under his army's lead. And armies are made up of corps, army groups and stuff like that. But so anyway, so they did that. And so these prayer cards started going out right around mid-December. And at the same time, the Germans launched what became the last major offensive for them of the war, called the Ardennes Offensive, which came through Northern Europe and through Bastogne and Belgium. And they were trying to get to Antwerp, which had become a major Allied port. And they wanted to divide the northern forces from the southern ones, kind of like that Long Island situation, and kind of deal with them and then deal with the others. So divide and conquer. And he hoped that would buy some time on the Eastern Front too, where the Russians were pushing hard, if he kind of knocked the Allies back on the West. And so these prayer cards went out, and soon thereafter, well, I should say a dramatic moment in all this is the Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division got trapped in Bastogne, surrounded, and they said, "Surrender." That word went to them. The Germans said, "Surrender or we're going to annihilate you." And so the Allied command, the general in charge of the 101st, sent a note back, and it just said "nuts." It's like, and they go, "What does this mean?" And so he was exhausted. They'd been fighting days and days. And so the man who delivered the note said, "It means go to hell. We're not surrendering." And they were in trouble, though. They were losing. There were only about 12,000 troops, and they were losing hundreds a day due to injury and whatever. And they were running out of food and ammunition and everything else. And the weather was still bad, so they couldn't be airdropped in. There was nothing that could be done. But Eisenhower gave Patton the go-ahead to try to relieve them there, and rescue them. And so he started from the south, trying to break into the Allied line. The Germans had created a big bulge in the Allied line.
Yeah.
So he comes in and hits the southern part of it. And then right before Christmas, they were getting close to Bastogne, but the weather also broke. And so the 101st Airborne they were able to resupply the 101st Airborne with some munition and some food. And so they were going to be able to hold out a little longer, with that, but they were losing men every day. And so then finally, the day after Christmas, the first American tank, made it through to Bastogne, and then the rest started. They opened the breach, and the 101st was rescued. But Patton attributed it all to after the prayer cards went, because the weather had been bad for literally months. And
Mm.
with no break in sight, it seemed. And so all of a sudden it broke clear. It was cold. It was chilly, like 15 degrees, but it was clear blue skies. And so they were able to start bombing using our fighter planes to attack the German positions and bombers to bomb. And so, it was it was the turning point. And then he saw that priest at the end of January. He wrote about it in his encounter, or I should say the chaplain did. And he said, he kind of slapped him with his riding crop, which Patton carried, even though he didn't have a horse. And he said, well done. He said, no, he said, our prayers worked. And I knew they would, chaplain, our padre, he said, padre, our prayers worked. And I knew they would. And the chaplain took it as his gesture of kind of hitting him, is like, well done. You did a good job. And
So this was a good slap,
yeah,
as opposed to
his
the
name
other
is,
slap.
yeah, I know. Yeah, he got in trouble with that too, but he got relieved for a while because of that. But
Yeah.
but O'Neill, this chaplain O'Neill, he's the only chaplain, unless this has changed very recently, but of all the chapels on army posts around the country, he's the only one where a chapel is named after him, a person instead of a unit or whatever else.
That's neat.
And so it's O'Neill Chapel at Fort Knox. So.
Benedict Arnold is a notorious name in American history. He's known as a traitor, but I don't think most people know, one, that he didn't go into he didn't come out of the womb a traitor. He didn't grow up thinking, I'm going to betray the colonies when I get the chance. He was actually a hero at one point, but then something changed. You talk about that in the book. Talk about that a little bit with us now.
Well, at West Point, the general, the superintendent at West Point, who's the 3-star general in charge, this is when I was a cadet there, he loved this story. So I first heard it through him. And then, of course, I verified or read the stuff myself, too. But he juxtaposed Benedict Arnold and George Washington. And they were both hero generals throughout a good part of the war. But then Benedict Arnold went off the rails. So Arnold had been a hero at the Battle of Saratoga and Ticonderoga, where they captured a fort. And so he was just this hero general. But he felt like he wasn't getting the plaudits that he deserved. Like he craved attention and esteem, I guess. He wanted to be recognized for all of his great exploits. And I mean, to some extent, obviously, we all want to be recognized when we do something good. And but it became a root of bitterness, you might say, in him, like the Bible talks about. And so he went off the rails. And when Washington kind of recognized he was a little disaffected, and so he wanted to give him another command so he can continue to do his exploits. But Benedict Arnold at that point had already hardened his heart. And so he asked to be command of the garrison at West Point, which was a post along the Hudson River before it was a military academy, and which didn't happen until 1802, was a military academy under Jefferson. But it was just a military post where there was a big bend in the river there. And so whoever controlled the Hudson River. And so if the British were able to control the Hudson River, then they could cut, because there weren't really bridges or anything back then. It was just a lot of ferrying that went on, ferry boats and whatever. And so they could cut the colonies in half, kind of separate New England, which was the hotbed of, a lot of it, and Virginia, of course, but
divide and conquer.
That could have been a major strategic loss, or would have been, if they could get West Point. And so Benedict Arnold made plans to turn over West Point. He was to give the plans of West Point to this Major Andre from the British Army. And then he was to let them know the best time when the garrison would be at its weakest, as far as sending troops out to do this or that they could attack and take it. And so Washington, in the providence of things, this is another example of providence, but Washington had happened to decide he was going to go inspect West Point at that time.
Wow.
So he was there, and Andre, in the meantime, had left with the plans, and he was heading back to New York City, where the British were garrisoned. They'd controlled New York City. And along the way, he came upon some people who he didn't realize were American militia, because one of the people was dressed in a British military uniform that he had captured or grabbed somewhere. So he just was wearing it for fun, or for maybe warmth or whatever. He was just wearing it. Yeah. But I mean, he was with other militia people. So they were just kind of guarding things. And so they, of course, knew he wasn't a Brit, and maybe he was wearing it in such a way that didn't make him look like a redcoat
Yeah.
as much.
Yeah.
But Andre
A
nonetheless
trophy,
mistook
maybe.
him for a, yeah, Andre mistook him for a British guy, and he said he was in civilian clothes at that point, which means he's a
Oh.
that's breaking the laws of war
Right, right,
too.
right.
And so uh, he said, regardless of how I look, uh, I'm not a civilian or a militiaman. I'm with the British Army, and I'm just trying to get back there. Can you help me? They're like, help you.
Oh
So
my gosh.
they searched him instead, and they found the plans to West Point, and they kept him. And then the word was sent back to West Point. Washington was supposed to have breakfast with Benedict Arnold that morning, but Arnold first learned that Andre, so they got word, he was in charge of the garrison. Hey, we captured this
Yeah,
guy. He's got
yeah.
the plans to the fort. And so he's like, oh, the jig is up. So he ran, and he was able to make it to New York City, and he didn't make it to his breakfast with Washington that he was supposed to have. And then Washington, pretty soon all the news came in, and Washington, he's like, Arnold has betrayed us. He's betrayed us.
Mm.
And so this was big news throughout all the colonies. They were
Wow.
burning Arnold in effigy and all this stuff. And he's like, and again, they attributed it to Providence, just the strange
Mm.
circumstances that all led to this
Yeah.
being discovered and prevented. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was another.
No kidding. I mean, that's well, it was wasn't it Franklin who said, I've lived long enough to realize that God works in the affairs of men. That's it's so undeniable when you look at things like this. Uh, hmm.
He said that at the Constitutional Convention. He's like, I've lived a long time, and the more I live, the more convinced I. It's in the book. The more convinced I
Oh,
am
good.
that God governs over the affairs of this world. And if a sparrow can't fall to the ground but is knowing, how can a nation
Yeah.
rise up? And so we need his help. And so he called for prayer during the Constitutional Convention.
But in the book, Randy, you argue that really America's track record on slavery is significantly better than anyone wants to admit, and better than most people know.
This is one of my big things in this book. So, because that's the big, cudgel that people use. America's not good. Our founding's horrible.
Ah.
Because we allowed slavery and all this stuff. And, of course, like you said, you got to go back thousands of years of history. Slavery is still going on today.
Oh gosh,
but,
yeah.
But at that time, of course, we were 150 years old as colonies when I should say, well, yeah, let me get 150 years old since Jamestown.
As we began landing Jamestown,
Plymouth and all that stuff. And so, the slavery was introduced into Virginia around 1619, as we know. I like to talk about that, but yeah, that's the fact.
Yeah,
so you got to go
that travesty.
So you got to go 150 some years. So we've had all this history of slavery, and nobody's countering it. There started to be an abolition movement, springing up in England and in the colonies, and around the time of the Revolution, it was starting to gain some traction. And so when the Revolutionary War happened, states started to outlaw slavery in the North because they weren't as dependent on slave labor like the Southern plantations were.
Right.
But like Benjamin Franklin and others that had slaves, he freed his, but it was common practice. And so, but a lot of the New Englanders like the Adams didn't have slaves. And so again, it wasn't all the founding fathers that had slaves. And the ones who did actually took active steps to begin ending the institution. And that gets
and treated them well.
Yeah. And that gets lost in this story. And so by 1800, all the states north of Maryland had outlawed slavery, Pennsylvania and all of them. And in fact, Benjamin Franklin became the president of the Abolition Society of Pennsylvania, which its purpose was to go beyond Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania had already voted to end slavery. And so, but that wasn't all. Like there were multiple steps. Even the Constitution itself is anti-slavery. When people talk about the 3/5 clause, they think, oh, they only thought of black people as 3/5 of a person. Well, no, I mean, that was a pro-abolition provision. And anybody who looks at the history and honest about it knows it, because the Southerners wanted every slave counted in terms of apportionment of votes in Congress. So by limiting the number of votes, and it was a compromise, that's the way things go, but It was a compromise. It limited the number of representatives that the South could have. So it was a nod to the fact that this institution of slavery was not right, and that you don't give these people the right to vote. And so that was the compromise reached. And so that was that. And then they also, oh, good.
So what you're saying, I think it sounds, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like the 3/5 compromise was not to say that Black Americans or slaves were 3/5 of a person. It was to say, gosh, if we count all of these slaves in the southern states because of apportionment, the South is going to have more votes in Congress and we'll be able to push slavery farther. But if we go with the 3/5 compromise, it'll keep the South from getting that leg up and we can keep moving toward abolishing slavery. Is that about right?
No, yeah, that's exactly right. Because there were lots of fights going on. Like one of them was what happens when people from the South move to the North with their slaves. And so that had to be decided that the local law would win. In other words, if you keep your slave there, it's not if you traveled through, they made provisions for that. But if you move there, those slaves were going to become free. And a compromise that it was that they would allow people to go bring back slaves who had escaped. Yeah, so that was another one of them.
Slave laws.
Yeah, the extradition, or however they, that sort of extradition is what the provision was. But another compromise, and this is where Jefferson has to get some big points. But they wanted to end the slave trade. And again, so these northern states, for the first time in modern history, are passing laws abolishing slavery. So no other countries around the world are doing that right now. It's not like America was behind the eight ball. Or behind the power curve. We were ahead. We were at the front side. And our abolition movement was moving ahead quickly. And so part of that was when the Continental Congress was meeting and they passed the Northwest Ordinance. At the same time, they were passing the Constitution across the street. It outlawed slavery in the new territories. So Ohio, Michigan, what would be Ohio? Its Northwest Territory was Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, those states. And so Illinois. So that was the first big with federal government power, that said, we're not going to have slavery in those territories. And Jefferson wanted it to extend all the way to the South. He wrote an ordinance to that effect a few years earlier, but that ordinance fell short by one vote in committee because a man was sick that day who would have voted for it. And so Jefferson lamented it. He's like, that's horrible. Heaven was silent, but I know that eventually this will change. And then when he was president, in the Constitution, there was provision to end the African slave trade, bringing slaves over from Africa or from the West Indies or whatever. And so they said the compromise was 20 years after the Constitution becomes in effect, more or less, 1808 is when you can end that. And so again, we're dealing with trying to keep the Union, but deal with the fact that the North doesn't want these slaves, and I know it's wrong, and the Christians are behind this movement. And so in 1807, in March of 1807, they passed the legislation to be effective on January 1st, 1808. They wanted it to happen the very first day it could. And so that's what happened. And who was president at that time? Thomas Jefferson, and he signed it into law. And he also introduced legislation when he was a member of the Virginia legislature to end slavery in Virginia, but it just couldn't get the number of votes we needed because they were dependent on that society, on those plantation society. Certainly the leaders were. And Washington himself, he was like, I would vote in a minute. There's multiple letters to Lafayette and others saying,
I've read some of them.
George and Morris in New Jersey, Governor Morris saying, hey, it will not lack my vote if we vote to abolish slavery. I want it. He said, I don't think it should happen abruptly. I think it should happen gradually, which is what it was happening in the northern states, just so people could be reintegrated into society. And then when he died, he had two wills. And I don't know, nobody knows exactly what was in the other will, but the will that he chose, he said, burn that one. But he said, this is the one I want. And so he had two wills, and in the will that he chose, and maybe it was the same in both wills, but in any case, that he freed all of his slaves at his death, because he wanted to set an example this was 1799, December 1799, to all the other, to his colleagues, to his fellow Virginians and plantation holders and that sort of thing. And there's a famous quote by an AME, black pastor at the time, and he said, with this act, he blotted out the only thing that could be held against this wonderful man. He set an example for history. And so that was the head of the AME congregation, which the largest African American one at that time, essentially. And so he really appreciated that gesture. And so yeah, there was a lot going on in the anti-slavery at the founding. So the founders were not slave lovers or holders. There were some that obviously they protected the institution, and even Jefferson, he was a slaveholder till the end. He freed just a few because he was massively in debt, but he took actions, and he wrote about it in his book Notes on the State of Virginia, saying, justice can't sleep forever. Unless we deal with this thing, it will eventually. God will. He said, God's justice can't sleep forever. So that's the way he saw it. And so he said that quote is in the Jefferson Memorial. So Frederick Douglass has a chapter in the book, and so he was a staunch Republican, and he liked Lincoln. There are some quotes out there where he would get frustrated with him and that sort of thing, but he knew that Lincoln was at the forefront of everything that he wanted to see happen. And so he was the first African American, to visit the White House in an official capacity. He came to see Lincoln, and then he went after his second inaugural address, and they tried to bar him entry because that's how the customs were. Oh, you're a black person. Yeah, you're black. You can't come in here. And so he said, I know that Abraham Lincoln didn't say I couldn't come in here. And so he saw somebody recognized going in, and he said, tell him that I've got a problem out here. And so word came shortly, let him in. He's supposed to be here. And then Lincoln, according to Douglas's account, he's like, Douglas, just the man I want to see. And, what did you think of my speech? The second inaugural address where he talked about slavery and Christianity and all that stuff, quoted the Bible. But I think one of the most powerful images of the war that I tried to describe was the fall of Richmond, and a black cavalry unit accompanied Lincoln and Tad, his son, through the rubble-strewn streets. And all these black people were coming out of the houses and just cheering him on, like Father Abraham and all this stuff. And there's an account where one black man came and knelt at his feet. It seems it's in a lot of the biographies. I don't think it's apocryphal, but if it is, well, it's maybe reflects the truth. But he knelt and he said, and Lincoln said to him, you don't kneel to me. You only kneel to God. Yeah. And he's who you serve. And from hereafter. So whether apocryphal or not, it's a powerful lesson.
The Frederick Douglass being barred at the White House thing is something that you hear critics of the U.S. point to. Oh, yeah, well, slavery had been abolished, but you still couldn't have a black man in the White House. I think what people don't recognize is that this is thousands of years of human custom ingrained in people. Yeah, it was going to take a few years for us to get, you don't turn a ship that large instantly. It was going to take us a few years, and it did. It took us 100 years to get to the 1960s and to get to the first few civil rights acts that were really good.
Yeah.
But America has just led the way on all of this. Let's talk about Doug MacArthur. General MacArthur. He is a general who, we were talking about Patton earlier, seven Academy Awards the film gets. George C. Scott becomes him. There's not that analog for Douglass. Douglass kind of faded from the psyche of the American people in some way, but he figures in your book. Tell us why he's there.
Well, I lived in MacArthur Barracks at West Point most of the time I was there. And his statue was right next to my room for one of the semesters. But I always liked, we had to learn his portions of his duty, honor, country speech. Duty, honor, country, those three hallowed words. Reverently dictate what you ought to be. Anyway, it goes on. But we had to memorize all this stuff. And so he was superintendent at West Point in the 1920s. So he's a big figure at West Point. I would say, in my mind, he's certainly, he and Patton are big. And then Ike is big, but I think MacArthur's bigger. Ike was a football coach at West Point, an assistant football coach, but never a superintendent. But and he was actually MacArthur's aide going into World War II, and then came back to the U.S. But no, MacArthur, I have really two chapters that deal a lot with him. And his famous phrase, if anybody knows MacArthur for anything, it's "I shall return." And so the context of that was the Philippines were a commonwealth like the Puerto Rico is today of the United States, also acquired in the Spanish American War like Puerto Rico was. And but they were on their glide path to independence. It was to happen in 46. So they had signed the agreements in 36 that 10 years later they would be independent. And so then the war kicks in. And so MacArthur was retired and he was working as their top military aide or field marshal is what they called him there in the Philippines. So Roosevelt said, "We need you back in the regular army here." So he brought him back, in the months before Pearl Harbor to kind of get the Philippines ready in case things went down. And then the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor, and then within a day, several hours, they hit the Philippines, and they uh, took out a lot of the Navy, or our Navy and Air Force there, such as it was. And then soon thereafter, within a few weeks, they invaded, and they forced our troops into the Bataan Peninsula, where we held out for some months. That was the only forces fighting against the American forces fighting against the Axis, Germany, Japan, Italy at that point. And so they were putting up a brave fight. They're putting up a brave fight, but Japan had a naval blockade and a bigger, navy in that region and everything. And so eventually they were going to have to surrender. So Roosevelt says, "I need you to leave the Philippines," which is tough for a commander because he's been working with these troops and he feels like he needs to share whatever fate theirs is. But Tokyo Rose, who was a propagandist for the Japanese at the time, said they were going to give him a necktie party by the Imperial Palace. And so basically it was they were either going to kidnap him or kill him. And the FDR didn't want that sort of propaganda victory for Japan. And so anyway, MacArthur eventually agreed to the order. Like he had to take a few days to mull it. They gave him a little space to kind of process it. And then he escaped by PT boat to the southern Philippines and then by bomber plane to Australia. And then from Australia, it took some years, but they returned then to the Philippines like he promised. So this all happened in spring of 42. He left March of 42. And then he came back in October of 44, strode ashore. "People of the Philippines, I have returned." Big guy. He had a big personality, a little bit haughty, someone would say. But by the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil. So anyway, just goes on. And so he was a big deal. My grandfather then served under him in the Philippines a little bit. And my uncle in the Navy was in the Navy in the Philippines region. And then my grandfather was part of the Japanese occupation after the end of World War II. So we have a samurai sword in our family that was acquired. I don't know exactly how. I think the Japanese had to give up all their weapons pretty much. So I don't know if it was given to him or if it was acquired, or I don't know. I don't know the whole story. But my brother has it. but and my nana, my grandfather had it in their place for a long time, but before they passed. But anyway, so MacArthur was a major figure. For 5 years, he was in charge of Japan, more or less. And he helped shepherd them on to democracy. And I'd go into all that in the book. And they helped him write a constitution, which was consistent with our constitutional protections.
But you talk about Reagan for sure. And in fact, he was your commander in chief, if I remember correctly. So tell us how he implements, how he figures into implementing these ideals that these truths that the founders held to be evident, and we do too.
So yeah, Reagan, I started West Point in 85. So that was in the peak of the Reagan Revolution, He could not have been more popular at that point.
Heady days.
And he had won 49 of the 50 states in the 84 reelection. And I missed being able to vote by just a few months. So I was like, darn. But I had represented him in the middle school during his 1980 race when we had our little in-school election. And I went.
That's great.
We had an all-school assembly, and so the most popular girl in school spoke for Carter. And then I was next. And so she had her placard on the podium. And so I went and I took that placard off the podium and I threw it into the audience. and the place went wild. And and Reagan won that in school election. I'll have you know. But I was in what, seventh or eighth grade at that point. But anyway, that was my
Firecracker, a
introduction.
firebrand, Randy.
So I loved Reagan from the first time I started hearing him. So I was what, 11 or 12 when he 13, I guess, when he ran. And so the first time, and so I was just very interested in politics at that point. But yeah, he was strong on these issues. When he stood up to the communists, it's kind of like going back to the beginning of this interview. The stateless, godless communists. When he gave a famous speech, which I quote in the book, where to the National Association of Evangelicals in 1983, and he said that communism, because of its godlessness and the totalitarian state and all rights only coming from what they think is right, that they're the focus of evil in the modern world. And that drew quite a lot of attention at the time, I remember. And but of course, he then was eventually able to work with Gorbachev, and he went and spoke. He asked to speak at Moscow State University in 1988, and they let him speak live to the whole country, which is amazing. And he talked about the Declaration of Independence and how our rights come from God. And they said, that's what our school children are taught. And so that's what you need to know. And so it was powerful. And of course, the Berlin Wall came down a little over a year after that. And I'd gone to Berlin as a cadet when the wall was still up. And I went through Checkpoint Charlie. And so I saw communism firsthand. There was nothing to buy in East Berlin. I got some of their Deutschmarks, and you couldn't buy a darn thing there that was worth buying. I think I got a drink or something, like a Coke or whatever. And not a hard drink, but and in the contrast, like West Berlin was just lights and joy, and we're riding this Ferris wheel, and just fireworks are going off in West Berlin, and I'm like, what is this all about? And they're just celebrating being free. And so it's just like, and it was dark over in East Berlin, and so I could see it firsthand. But he saw. It's interesting. He liked Trump, and actually, I do quote Trump a few times in the book, in the introduction, and in the end, I quote him for this idea that he's strong on this idea that rights come from God, not government, and he said that in multiple. And I quote him from his Mount Rushmore speech in 2020, and then from his prayer breakfast speech, and then he also, of course, had the national rededication that he called on May 17th, of this year. Where they rededicated the nation to God. And I quote, and I did in the original book, I quoted the May 17th, 1775 or 76 Continental Congress proclamation, calling for prayer and fasting. And then, when I quoted back during the revolutionary section, but then he picked that same date, and they say he didn't really know it. He just, his advisors or whomever, they picked it to the exact day 250 years later.
Wow.
That we would have this rededication to God thing. Wow. And so it's amazing. So no, I do try to give Trump his credit.
Randy, where can people get the book?
It's on Amazon right now, and it will be going to other places soon, but right now it's at Amazon. And so you can find it there. I have my old version will be there for a little while. So you want to make sure that it's the cover in the back of me there, where it's got 9 faces instead of 3. And so that's the one you want to go to. And you can find links to it on my social media at Randy DeSoto on X, or on Instagram, Randy DeSoto, those things. So yeah, if you're confused about the link, just go to one of those places.
Well, the book is We Hold These Truths. It's by Randy DeSoto. Randy, thank you so much for your time today. And for the Western Journal, I'm Josh Manning. Thanks for watching.